Welcome back to Building Extraordinary Brands, the podcast where we delve into the art and science of building standout brands and businesses. Today we have an exceptional guest who is a master of visual identity and graphic design. David Airey is a renowned graphic designer and writer dedicated to crafting distinctive, meaningful visual identities and educating others on the same. Since launching his business in 2005, David has worked with clients in more than 30 countries, ranging from global corporations to individual entrepreneurs, while remaining completely independent. With 4 best-selling books under his belt and 2 hugely popular online publications, David has established himself as a thought leader in the world of design. David was an early influence on my career and one of the main reasons I started blogging back in the day. David and I were regular commenters on each other's blogs back when that was a thing. And blogging literally catapulted my career, giving me exposure to be headhunted by an agency on the other side of the world. So it could be said that without meeting David way back then, I may not be here today. So thank you, David. And with that said, we're going to actually dive into that, like the journeys of the independent designer, because that's something both David and I deeply value. And we're going to explore the intricacies of identity design as well, the process of that. And that's something both David and I have much love for. And we're going to get some insight from David and his experience. And yeah, I think that's enough said for now. Let's welcome David to the show. So good to connect again, David.
Yes, very much so, Jacob. Thank you for that exceptionally kind introduction. I'm glad you asked me to come on. And it's great to see you after all these years. Obviously, we've been in touch. Quite a bit, but this is the first time that we've been talking face to face. Well, even though it's on a video call, but yeah, it's great.
Yeah, really. So let's actually go back a bit. Like 2005, it was a totally different time back then in the online space. Blogging. Can you remember like what made you get into identity design?
I remember that it was the aspect of design that I enjoyed the most, specifically logos. That's where it started. Well, before that, I was taking on jobs where I said yes to almost everything. So there was a lot of web design involved, and it soon became clear that that's not what I wanted to do because it was so frustrating for me. I wasn't as good as I wanted to be, and one little error in the code could throw things out across a couple of different browsers. And what I liked about logo design in particular was that you're distilling the essence of a business into this one small mark, and you can take on more projects than you would if you were involved with web design or web development, because you work on it for maybe 4 weeks or 12 weeks and then you're on to the next client. So you're constantly learning about different businesses as well.
Yeah, that's what I enjoy as well about identity work. It's always a new thing, right? It's not just one industry or one facet. It's like it's always new. There's always a new challenge, a new problem, and it keeps things fresh. And as designers, we love solving problems. So.
Definitely. Yeah, it was an art design course that I was enrolled on, and before I started in self-employment, and the graphic design and the logo design in particular is what I enjoyed, and I'm just fortunate that I can be doing the work that I do enjoy. I know so many people aren't.
Totally. I have a similar thing. Like it wasn't necessarily that I didn't like web design, which I ended up doing like 5 years of interactive web work. So I definitely love that side of it. But like you, I also love the idea of encapsulating a whole business's identity and like essence into one single mark, which is a challenge, and it's can be fun at the same time.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, like I said, I'm fortunate to be doing what I'm doing, and logos that's kind of where it all started for me. It's where the enjoyment came from, and just kept that up. It's almost 2 decades now. It's just a bit scary thinking back.
Well, let's talk about that. Like, how have you seen the field of design and identity change over the past, say, 2 decades?
Well, it's funny. There's obviously been an advance in tech and software, but for me, the foundation of good design is still a memorable idea. That same thinking goes back to the days of Paul Rand and Saul Bass, Bob Gill. If the idea doesn't underpin the work, then the design is more superficial. Kind of like window dressing and window displays are they're changed a lot more regularly than a strong logo or visual identity should be. What about you? We've been doing this for a similar length of time. Has there been anything that's radically changed in how
Well,
you'd approach
I
a design
follow,
project?
yeah, so friend Bill Gardner, he does the logo trend reports each year, and it's always
Mhm.
interesting seeing those reports that he puts out. And he probably is like the one guy that sees the whole landscape of logo design. So when he puts those reports out, you can kind of see how things shift and change. The fundamental principles, as you said, are there, but I think they are evolving. The intricacies of technology and the fact that it has to work on different sizes, digital and flat and so forth. I think that has changed the approach to some big brands, especially, and how designers approach logo design. But when you look at the most timeless, versatile, best logos, I use that very loosely. They often follow those principles that we're talking about. They're simple and they convey a certain idea, and that's really the essence of logo design, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Stripping it back to the black and white mark, even though not everything's shown in black and white. Color is a big part of it, and especially with screen time. That's mostly where most logos are shown. But I would always design a logo with motion in mind, but at the same time, it's got to be a solid idea when it's flat and static, because even though motion can be a big part of it, if you're driving past a billboard or if you're driving past a sign on the top of a building, the static is a big part of it. So if it looks simple and distinctive, there's a balance there between the two. Yeah, the flat mark in black and white, that's where I would start, and then we'll add color and motion later on.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned motion, because that's often like an afterthought. Like, it's not very often that designers will think of it in motion and thinking how it's actually going to be brought to life. It's usually like, well, let's get the essence, the black and white version done, and then work in motion. So I've seen some where they work the other way around, and it's pretty impressive how it comes to life, because it was purposely built for motion. I can't think of any examples right now, like off the top of my head, but there's someone brand new that I saw there that just it was focused on motion. Well, let's make a little shift into the independent designer. This is something we both value. You've been independent since 2005. So, what does independence mean to you? Like, why did you choose this route?
Well, choosing the hours that I work and choosing the projects that I work on, kind of setting the direction of my career, not leaving it up to somebody else. When I was in my old job, before becoming independent, I knew I'd be able to do something similar for a lot more companies. I was doing design projects for the one company, and I knew that I could broaden the scope of what I was learning, to keep things continually interesting. And I suppose to give you an example, I work in a garden office. It's a garden room. My house is just there, a few meters away, and I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. My 6-year-old loves football, and he'll often come out and he'll slide open the door and he'll say, "Danny, can we play football?" And the ability just to say, "Right, I'm going to take a break for 15, 20 minutes and go into the garden and play football with him."
I hear you, man. I hear you.
That's
So
one of
I have
the
3 kids. Yeah,
yeah.
3 kids, exactly the same thing. I have a separate office to the house, and you think it would be an escape, but it's not. They would come knocking on the door, come play with the podcast equipment. And yeah, it is one of those like blessings and curses at the same time. It's like, I need my peace, but I'm so blessed to be at home and be able to, have that option there to have a kick around and so forth. So
Yeah.
number one for you is family, it sounds like, and
Family is
like
a big
freedom
thing.
of and freedom of choosing your work hours. Are those the 2 big things for independence for you?
I would say so, but also the fact that if I want to take a sabbatical of sorts for a few months, and just not do any work, just Stefan Sagmeister comes to mind, with his one year, he'd separate his retirement and he'd bring it back.
1 year sabbatical.
Yeah. For me, it would be a much shorter term.
Okay, 3 months. Yeah, but a lot of people listen to that like, I could take a 3-hour sabbatical.
Yeah, any time frame. Just not to have somebody looking over your shoulder the whole time. There are aspects that I miss about working with other people in an office-based scenario, but at the same time, I think I would struggle to go back just because I enjoy being around my family most of the time. And I enjoy the freedom of just being able to say, I'm not going to do any work for the rest of the day. Also, I've had kind of chronic headaches for almost a couple of decades now, and maybe once every couple of weeks, it'll be a bit debilitating where I'll need to just go to bed and lie down in a dark room. So if I was working for somebody else, I can imagine that would be quite a thorny subject if that was happening once every couple of weeks, but I have the luxury of being able to do that without it affecting my work. If I'm working with a client, I'll still give it everything, and I'll still be able to produce the results that I say I will, and delight my client most of the time, which is fantastic. But the ability to
we have family, like health reasons, and like the freedom to choose what you want to work on. And I know you do a lot of self-published things. You got a couple of books and you write a few online publications, so you have some client work as well. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, when you're working as an independent, you can do multiple things, and like you can switch up what you're doing. And that's for me, that's about curiosity and doing new things and trying new things. And that's like a big value of mine. I'm curious on your perspective on that. Like, is those self-initiated projects something that drives you, and that's something you value a lot?
Definitely. I would recommend that anybody start a project that they're interested in if they're not getting paid for it, if nobody's asked them to do it. Whether that's, well, for me, writing the book was the big one. Although,
which book? The first one?
The first one,
Design Love?
Logo Design Love, which was first published in 2009. Yeah, it came about on the back of the Logo Design Love website, which is something I started up just because I enjoyed logo work. And I was publishing logo blog posts for maybe a year before Nikki McDonald at Peach Pit, which is part of Pearson Publishing. She sent me an email out of the blue to ask, would you be interested in writing a book with us? And I hadn't been thinking about writing a book, but I went ahead with it. And a year later, the book came out, and it's now in a second edition in 13 languages. And clients will pick up my book in foreign languages and send me an email and say, can you design a logo for us? So that all came about as the result of the self-initiated Logo Design Love website, which is still on the go, but not as much as it was back in the day. I don't publish as much as I used to. And just because I'm not working as often as I used to, I used to work a lot more, but then, it's like kids come around and you want more time to yourself, that type of thing. You want that screen time. Yeah. So self-initiated project definitely worked out nicely for me.
So we've talked about like the advantages of it, right? The freedom and the independence and self-initiated projects. On the flip side of that, what would you say like the challenges of working independently are?
Well, there's no one who tells you what to charge. And you decide your own rates, and that was a big incentive for me, but it was also one of the biggest challenge, because people can give you some indication, but no one knows your education and experience like you do, and no one knows the attention to detail you put into a project. And well, another thing is you can't meet every client in person. You can't be meeting face to face for building a relationship. So I'm unlikely to create the strongest of bonds through phone and video calls, but it doesn't mean that you can't do the work effectively. It just means that it's not to the same extent as it would have been if every client was, you could sit down with them for an hour or two and just get to know them a bit better, because often it's the small personal details in the client's background that can make a big impact in how the final logo or identity looks. An example would be, there was a project I did for my drum school, which is a Singapore-based drum school, and I was chatting to the owner. In the course of our discussions, there were 4 numbers that came to mind that meant a lot to him. It was the house number, that he started his studio in. He's since expanded into multiple locations. There was the number of staff that he had. There was, and there was another couple of reasons that I can't recall. But the logo design was, it was the spinning of a drumstick, because that was one of the things that stood out to a lot of drummers when they saw a drummer on stage spinning the drumstick. They thought, yeah, I want to be up there doing that. So I made this circular design with trace lines, and to capture the sense of motion, even though it was a static mark, I put these little notches at 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. And it was those four numbers that meant a great deal to him. And that made it a lot easier to sell the idea and to get to the end of the project.
Yeah. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this. So like, what makes you think that you can get that detail in person versus like, you know, on a call or something? Like, could you extract that information on a call or a Zoom or something?
Yeah, that was actually on Zoom, so it probably wasn't the best example. It was just one that came to mind.
But I get you. Like, the challenge is like, if you could do it in person, you have that nuance and you can build that rapport and relationship. I get.
Yeah. A better example would have been, there was a client of mine who works in a cheese factory in Switzerland, and he was in London, so I flew to London to meet him. Otherwise, it would have been a couple of, or 2 or 3 flights each. And we just sat down in the airport lounge for, but it was about 3 hours, and got to know each other and built up more of a rapport, like you say. And he ended up being one of my biggest clients. And I don't think that would have happened, because actually I never previously spoke to him on a phone or video call. It was his brand manager. But that fact that I could go and meet with the boss of this huge cheese company was, that made a big difference, I think.
Okay. So we've talked about the benefits, which are very obvious in most cases, but also the challenges around, pricing, working for yourself, and, the fact that you may not necessarily meet people. Is there anything else before we get into the next segment you'd add?
Well, one of the challenges, or one of the benefits, what was it?
The challenges, yeah.
The challenges of being independent was, well, there's more responsibility on you to find what works. If you're employed by somebody else, they take a lot of the control out of where your path is going. And the fact that we can both support our families without somebody else telling us what we need to be working on, I think that's a big part of it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, what advice would you give to people, listening to this, like aspiring designers or entrepreneurs that want to get more freedom? What advice would you give them to get started and, thrive?
Well, one of the big things for me was, when I started out, I brought my old employer on board as my first client, and I left that job to go traveling for a while because I hadn't seen much of the world. And when I came back to the UK, my role at that business hadn't been filled, and I pitched the idea of working with them for 3 days a week, invoicing at the end of each month. So they were my client for about 18 months for those 3 days, until they needed to find somebody full time, because I couldn't do everything that they needed me to do. So that retainer client was a big deal for me. And if you can't do that, I would say to tell everyone you know what you're doing. A few of my first projects were for friends and family, and that definitely helped. But a point on that is that you need to treat them just like any other client. Put terms in place, get a down payment, set a time frame, and keep it as professional as possible. Or if you're doing it for free, or a service trade with friends or family, then invoice them as if you're charging the full rate, but at 100% discount. And that way, your friends get a better sense of the value you're bringing, and they're more likely to trust your ideas.
Yeah. I have a similar story, David. It's getting some runway. I was working for someone else and I built the business up while working from someone else. So I had that kind of foundation there that you could build upon while still having some safety. I guess you don't have to just go all in, which you can, but I'm a big believer of learning from others as well. And my story is a little bit different because I was only independent after working for someone for about 5 years or so. I learned a lot from the ad industry and then went out on my own full time. So I was doing both, I guess. So my advice for people trying to go fully independent is like take things slow, because you can learn from others and you can build up your business slowly with a bit more foundation. And if you have a runway, when I say runway, it's like you have savings to support you over time as you build your business up. Another question for you, David. Is there any stories or personal experiences that you could share about where, it's like your independence actually impacted your career or your like a project, like in a big way?
Well, there was the first book that I mentioned, the Logo Design Love book, and then that led on to this second, the third, and the fourth, as you mentioned kind of in the introduction.
One little shift, hey? It's like you get an email out of the blue, and then you have a book, and then another book, and another book.
And that I had thought about self-publishing after a while, but all those 4 titles are with established publishers, and what that helps with is it takes a lot of the burden off me in terms of the printing and the sales. I come up with the content and then they put it out there and then they handle the translations. And the last 2 in particular with Rockport, the identity design books, I wasn't expecting them to be hardbacks, but when I saw the difference is huge, between the paperbacks that I have and the hardbacks. The print quality is great. So that was a big thing. That led into, I was trying self-publishing through Amazon's KDP. I had a range of low content books that I put on there. It was about 100 of them, and things like notebooks and sketchbooks. They're really easy. You just upload a PDF for the cover and upload a PDF for the inside spreads, and then you fill out the Amazon details for the page. And that was, I put about 3 months work into that, and I ended up making about 15,000 a year. And it was kind of like a set it and forget it thing. But it ended after Amazon, they scrubbed my account through plagiarism. And that was because it was something like, I used an image off unsplash.com for one of the covers. And what was it? It was somebody's graffiti painting of Batman. It was a blank comic book. That's what it was. I was selling a blank comic book, and the cover had Batman on it, and they said that no, you can't do this. So that was like a strike against my account, and I had a couple of different versions of that cover, and then I unpublished the other version, but because it was still sitting in my account, you can't delete it. Somebody at Amazon looked at it and thought, oh no, you're not getting away with that again.
Oh man, that's so frustrating.
Yeah, it was frustrating because I was paying quite a few bills, and then out of the blue, no, you're not doing that again. So there's ups and downs, but it was fun playing with the Amazon self-publishing. Although one thing that I did learn is that the print quality there, it doesn't compare to what you would get if you were working with a publisher, because they choose much better printers.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let's talk about your latest book. It's Identity Design. Is that the right the process? Is that the right name?
Identity Design, the process. Yeah, that's the process.
It. Yep. Yeah. So let's talk about identity design first, right? Like, how would you define a strong visual identity?
There are 3 main elements that I like to keep in mind. A good identity should be distinctive, relevant, and simple. And by distinctive, I mean that it needs to separate the client business from competitors. And although clients can be very different in terms of how brave they are about the design result, some want radically different, some want to fit in, but with a subtle difference. And that leads to relevance, which it can't look too out of place. For example, you wouldn't have a law firm looking like a children's toy brand, or a sports team looking like a funeral director. And then finally, by simple, I mean that the identity should have only as much detail as it needs and no more. The less detail, the easier it is to remember. Now, there's a balance there, obviously, because if something's too simple, it becomes generic, and that goes against the distinctive aspect.
So it's finding that the right balance between those three principles.
Yeah, distinction, relevance, and simplicity. That's what I keep in mind whenever I'm starting out any project and any identity project.
So with that said, like what makes the design memorable and effective then?
Well, a memorable design it's something that goes back to the distinction. It needs to look different from the competitors. You're not going to remember it if it's the same. And if it's effective, that goes back to the relevance. It needs to be appropriate. And then the third point, again, simplicity. You're not going to remember it if there's so much detail that you can't take it in after a short glance.
So let's go on the other side of it. Like, some logos are definitely not simple. They have a lot of intricate details. Where's the nuance there? Like when can you break the rule of being simple and make it extremely intricate, for example?
Well, I suppose if you're creating a coat of arms, then there's going to be a lot more detail involved. Someone's not going to see that and then 10 seconds later be able to accurately sketch it. But if I was putting a coat of arms as part of a logo project, that would be an additional element. There would still be the word mark and often a separate symbol, whether that's just extracting a letter from the word mark or coming up with something that's going to work on a social media avatar. So there can be detail involved. I'm not saying don't make anything detailed. It's just that if you want a logo to work to be as effective as possible, then it needs to work at tiny sizes. So having this simple mark that you can use on anything, and then adding detail for even if you were blowing up a simple mark, you could add detail to that. But if you can scale it down and remove certain elements, then yeah, it's going to be more effective for the client.
And what's your take on like logo suites where you have different variations of a logo? So let's say one for a billboard, one for digital, and one for really small applications.
If you can keep things looking cohesive, if everything works together, if one element looks like it fits in with the other elements, then the more flexibility you can give your client in terms of different logo layouts and different identity elements. Some people refer to it as an identity toolkit, where you have a range of files that you can offer, and then it's not a case of the client going away and using this one mark everywhere. No, it's giving them a little flexibility to keep things fresh. So yeah, I'm all for producing different elements within the identity. It's not just a single logo, a single pattern, a couple of different photos. If you put in place a set of guidelines that lets your client then expand that themselves, even if you put a few photos into a brand gallery and say, look, this is the style that you should go for, and then they can expand that gallery over time, then it gives them more ownership, and they'll not have to come back to you as often. That's one of the goals that I have with my clients, is that I want them to work with me for a period of weeks or months, and then I've given them everything they need for the next 10 years. That's what I'll try and do.
Yeah. So in like a logo toolkit or a logo suite, it can, just to elaborate further, it could have, a version where it's horizontal or it's stacked or left aligned or just the logo or a logo with the tagline, just so there's, versatility and flexibility with the whole identity. And that's kind of what we're referring to for people unfamiliar with the terms.
Definitely. Yeah. That type of thing's a big benefit for the client.
So delving into the process, we've kind of talked about like what makes a strong identity and what makes it memorable and some of the key points there. But in terms of the process of creating a really strong identity. You've written a book on it. Did you find any similarities between all the people that you interviewed or compiled, like all the different projects? Did everyone have a very similar process, or did you find that it was different?
There were a lot of similarities. Some people would go through maybe 5 or 6 stages. Other people would go through 3 or 4 stages. And then there are others that say, don't have a process, just be flexible. But
I
I'm
don't
of the
agree with
opinion,
that because it's still a process.
Yeah, exactly. I think when I heard that, the aim that they were getting at was to don't be too rigid. If you're at one stage and it's not working, you can take it back. Well, that's how I interpret it, because I think that made more sense to me. My process is that, well, the book sets out the process in 4 steps. There's the research, the strategy, the design, and the implementation.
Before you delve into those, can I just ask, did you choose those 4 steps based on your process or from understanding everyone else's? How did you come to that? I'm going to break it into 4 stages.
That was how I worked. The first time I heard it in those labels was, it might have been about 10 years ago, whenever it was Bobby and Jennifer of OCD Studio, the original champions of design. I think they've since rebranded, but yeah, they gave a talk and they said research, strategy, design, and implementation, and that stuck with me because it's pretty much exactly how I was working, but I just hadn't given it those labels before. And what I found then, after talking to a lot of other people, was that it's very similar across the board. There might be 1 or 2 more steps in there. People might break it down a little differently, label the titles differently.
Many ways to slice a pie.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about your process then. Let's do those four steps. What are we doing in each of those steps? And if someone was kind of listening to this, what recommendations would you make at each step? Let's just talk about that.
Well, the research is what I would break that down into 2 parts. There's the research that I do before I'm hired, and then the research that comes after. And some people might ask, well, you're working before you're hired, but it's a smaller part of the research, and that makes you aware whether or not you're the right fit with the client. You look into their business background. It's really just doing a bit of due diligence. You look at their website, you find out exactly what they're doing. And this is before they're talking to you. Well, before they've decided to hire you, and before you have decided whether or not they're a good fit for you. And the bulk of the research comes after I would receive a 50% down payment. Sometimes the 50% is a little different. It depends on the size of the project, but more often than not, I'll ask for 50% in advance, and then the remainder would come at the completion whenever the client's happy, but before I send any original design files. So that helps speed things up in terms of getting that final payment received. And after the research, there's the strategy, which is essentially having a plan before any design work takes place. So what I'll do is I'll look at the research, and then I'll come up with maybe 3 or 4 ideas that I can explain to the client in words or in writing to gauge their ideas on which is the right fit before I sit down in Illustrator or before I sit up.
When you say ideas, you mean this is it's a crest, or this is a symbol, or this is abstract. Is that what you mean by idea? Or
it would be how the design is going to look and the meaning behind it, and how that encapsulates
the idea.
Yeah, the idea behind the identity. So there'll be 3 or 4 different ideas, or you might call them design directions. And it's to keep the client involved, to give them more of a say, and to avoid the big reveal where in the past, whenever I started,
that's what I was kind of getting at. The design direction, it's not here's the exact idea for the logo, but it's the idea of the direction, the direction.
No, it could be this is how your logo is going to look, and this is how it's going
Oh,
to
okay.
play out across different elements, and this is how you can make a pattern out of it, and this is how it could be moving, motion design, and this is how
Oh,
you could
that's really
incorporate.
interesting, David. Like you're visually talking about like ideas and how things could look and play out without showing anything and just getting vibe back on.
Yeah, yeah. That
Okay.
I found that speeds up the process immeasurably, rather than me putting in place, a few pages in a PDF where I've sat down and actually designed the idea, and then the client comes back, no, that's not right. If I can,
Okay.
if I can express it in as quick a way as possible, which is through a few sentences talking, and then gauge their feedback, it makes it much easier to get the right
Okay.
idea and to get it done well without taking up any more of the client's time than is necessary.
Okay. So you can buy in for the idea. They're choosing one direction and then you go off and explore that direction.
It depends on how many the client wants to see. Sometimes they'll want to see 2 or 3 ideas. Often I will just share one, because by talking about a few different ideas at the start, then I can gauge how excited they are about a particular direction. And if they want to just go ahead with this one, then they don't need to pay for 2 ideas or 3 ideas to be developed in a PDF presentation. So it depends how much the client wants to invest in terms of money and time, and how excited they are about one of the ideas that we've talked about. So usually
Okay.
it's 1 or 2, rarely 3, but never more than that.
Okay. So research strategy, get the buy-in on an idea, and then the stage 3 is next.
The design,
Design.
which is where
Yeah.
I'll tell the client, okay, I'm going to go away for 2-3 weeks, and you might not hear from me, but rest assured, I'm doing the work for you. And after that, we'll come back, and if it's a Zoom call, we'll go through the presentation page by page. It might be a PDF that's 30 or 40 pages showing the logo.
Okay. So you're sharing the full visual identity at this point,
Yeah,
not just
yeah,
the
that's
logo.
right. Yeah,
Okay.
it would be the logo, and there'd be a lot of context in there, and imagery. And I'll sometimes try my hand at copywriting, because words can be just as important as visuals. And when you bring the two together, it can really strengthen an idea. So we'll talk about that, and there might be some refinements that need made. It's rarely a case going back to the drawing board, because the client has already said that they're happy with the idea, so they kind of know what to expect. It's just when they see the realism in the mock-ups, it kind of builds the excitement a bit more. So
Yeah, absolutely. It brings it to life, mock-ups, and they can see it all,
Mhm.
what it's actually going to look like. But this is really, really insightful, because, it's like the one concept approach, which is controversial, but you're actually getting to buy in at, before the actual design stage with the idea, which can be helpful, very helpful.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture of the two. And there is one
Yeah.
idea being presented a lot of the time, but the client knows what that idea is going to be, because we've talked about a few different options beforehand.
Yep. Great. And the final step.
Yeah, implementation is how the client rolls it out, what printers they're going to work with, or can I put them in touch with any motion designers, because I don't take on that aspect of the job, or how easy is it going to be for a company that has offices internationally to keep things looking consistent. Now, by consistent, it doesn't mean it can't be flexible. I'll design the guidelines so that there's some room to maneuver in there for clients. It's not going to look the same no matter. Well, just gives them a bit of ability
So,
to change the look of
question:
something
How
without having
how
to
do
come back to
you?
me.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's fine. No problem.
Question I was going to ask around implementation, right? The challenge designers have is like, here's the design work, here's the style guide. Now, like, here's your brand, and like, good luck. Like, how do you ensure that all the strategy and all the design is actually used correctly?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question, and it's one that it can be difficult sometimes, because you could give all the files to your client, and then half a year later you might look at their marketing
Yeah, it's
material,
like
and
usually.
you just take a peek at their website, or for example, and you see, oh, I would not have done that. So I'll always say to my clients, I'm on hand. If you have any questions, come back to me. If you want a second opinion on how your promotional material is going to look, if you're weighing up a couple of different options and you want me to cast an eye on it, I'm happy to do that for any of my clients at no extra charge. They come back to me, and it'll
Because
probably
yeah,
be
it's a
about.
reflection of our work. Like they can see the work in the portfolio, and then they visit their site, and there's like a disconnect, and it's helpful for both parties to get it done right.
Definitely, because there are projects in my portfolio where if a client then, or a potential client then, goes to the company website that I've worked for and it's different, then they're going to be wondering, well, what's going on here? But there's also times whenever I'll put ideas in my portfolio that the client didn't choose. If there were two directions and I thought one was stronger, the client obviously has the final say. But sometimes things on the client side, they're strong enough in their opinions to go against my advice, which is they're totally entitled to do. But ultimately, they're hiring me for my advice and my expertise. So if I think that something is stronger from a visual aspect, or for their, well, I was going to say for their business goals, then I'll put that in my portfolio. And in that case, if somebody looks at the client website and then looks at my portfolio entry, there's going to be a big disconnect. But ultimately, I want work in my portfolio that I feel is best representative of my
Absolutely.
strengths.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's talk about one example. Like we talked about the process and how to actually bring an identity to life. Could you share a case study of a project that you're really proud of, and anything else you want to share on that?
Well, there was drum symbol that I mentioned with the notches that stood out just
Yes.
because of the personality and how easy it was to get consensus with the client. There was another one that I designed for Wonder Years, which is a psychiatric practice in New York, and the owner, he came to put into this symbol form. The ideas were relevant because one was life sequences. He dealt with a wide range of people coming into his psychiatric practice, and the life sequences that he spelled out to me, there was 5 of them. There was birth, childhood, then your adult working years, your retirement, and death. And that was one facet that he wanted as a form of symbol. And then there was also a guiding star type of aspect where he wanted people to see his practice as somewhere that would guide them into the future, that would help their current situation. And then another idea that he wanted implemented was this a fish theme, because he had fish in his practices, and fish, there's studies that have been done that show that if you're looking in a fish tank, or if you're looking at fish swimming, it can be very calming. And he wanted to give that sense to his clients. So I had to try and amalgamate these things into a symbol somehow, while keeping it simple enough to scale down.
That's a challenging one.
Yeah,
Fish and
it was.
5 and like
It was a challenge,
cycles
but
and process.
yeah, I was really happy with the result though, because I had these 5 fish swimming in a circle. So it was the 5 for the life stages. There was the fish, and then the negative space in the middle of them formed a star. So that was one of
Genius.
the standout ones.
Yeah, that's great. You can visually see that. Well, I can in my visual mind, but I'm a logo designer.
Yeah,
But that's brilliant.
that was a challenge. Another one that comes to mind is I'm working on a project at the minute for a nurse. Her name's Kate Shimarani. She's in England, and she has the tagline of "Natural Nurse in a Toxic World." And she wanted her logo to be very personal because she works independently. I asked her to write her name, write her name a few times and send it to me. And I then digitized her signature and made it a bit more legible and sent it back, and she loved it. And that goes back to one of the main lessons in my new book, Identity Design, the Process, where one of the first blogs that I remember reading back when we were both starting out was Noisy Decent Graphics by Ben Terrett.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
There was a blog post that he had on there that I included in the book. It was titled "Always Do It for Real," and that was one of the things in there was handwriting. Don't use a handwriting font. How can you have a handwriting font anyway? Write it out. And I wrote it out for her. She loved it, and that's always do it for real. If
it's
you
so
need
authentic, and and I think just to wrap this all up, the key here is that these logos are telling a story, right? They have meaning, there's relevance, and it works for the owner, and if people are curious about it, they can ask about the story, but it's there to identify and tell a story. That's what logo design is about, and that's what we do as logo designers, like try to encapsulate the whole business brand like into a single mark. So
well said.
David, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad we could reconnect. Final question, I just want to know if you have any upcoming projects or books or anything else you'd like to share with our audience.
My latest book is the big one, Identity Design, the Process, published by Rockport, and it was released in the States and Canada last month, 2 months ago in the UK. It's a 240-page hardback where,
I have it here. It's brilliant.
Yes, thanks for picking that up. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. People pick it up on Amazon, Identity Design Process. David has a bunch of other books as well. Logo Design Love was his first one. I also have that back here. And there's more that you can check out at davidairey.com, which is spelled AIREY. David, I'm sure you can figure out. But thank you again, David. Cheers.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Jacob.